everyone, it's Kathy. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'll be sharing a Slimline card using the new Snail Mail Stamp Set from Whimsy Stamps along with the new Buttercup Slimline paper pack. And one of the things that I wanted to concentrate mostly on is how I colored up these little snails. As you can see, I've already colored one of them, and then I decided that I was just going to jump in and color in the second one and explain what I did. I thought it would be easier for you to see if I did a bigger snail. So for their little bodies, I started out with YG91 and I added that in the areas where the shadows would be the darkest. So particularly underneath their shells, or for this guy around where the letter is hanging out of his mouth. And then I blended that out with BG90. Now for their snail shells, I started out with BV00 and I added that again in the areas where it would be the darkest. So on this little guy, it was next to the little envelope and then along the bottom of his shell. And I went up around the left-hand side of the shell and left a little bit of a white area between the BV00 and the stamped line. I used the BV00 to do a little bit of underpainting, and then I came in with Y26 and I blended directly over the BV00. And I also went a little bit further past the BV00 and I did kind of trace around the little swirl on his shell. And I did color all of the snails the exact same way. After I was done with the Y26, I came in with Y15 and I blended out the Y26 and I colored in most of the shell. I did leave some white space at the very top of the shell and then around the swirl of the shell, and then I finished up with Y13. I'll be sure to have all of the colors that I used listed in the description box below for you, as well as all of the products that I used. To color in the little package, I wanted to have the shadows be underneath the folds on the package, so I started with E55 and then I just finished up the package with E31. I kept the coloring really very simple on these images. They're a good size to color and they're easy coloring. On the mail bag, I started out with B93 and quickly realized that I was going to need a darker color, so I came in with B97 and went over the B93 and I added that in the areas where it would be the darkest. So where the flap of his mail bag is over the bottom, I did do the B97 underneath there just to create a little bit of a shadow. Then I blended it out with the B93 and I left a little bit of a white space down the center of the mail bag. And then I finished off the mail bag with B52 and then I did come back in with the B97 just to reinforce some of those shadows. After I was done coloring in the little snails, I decided that they needed a little bit of texture, so I came in with B93 and added little dots on their bodies closest to their shell and up along the back side of their body. For the envelopes that are in the mailbox, I wanted them to have a pretty good shadow closest to the interior, so I started with C3 and I added that closest to the inside of the mailbox. Then I blended that out with C1 and then I used my colorless blender just to soften up some of the harsher lines. For the mailbox post, I started out with E37 and I added that just underneath the mailbox and then from the bottom up. I blended that out with E35. I left a little bit of white space and finished up with E31. For the mailbox itself, I used the same blue markers as I did for the mail bag. And I started out with B97 and added that on the very inside above the letters and then underneath the little envelope. And then for the little lip on the mailbox, I did a line of the B97 underneath it and then just above it. I added a little bit of the B97 underneath the snail because he would be casting a shadow on top of the mailbox. And then I flicked up from the bottom just a little bit, and on the very back end I did again leave that white space between the B97 and the stamped line of the mailbox. I blended that out with the B93 and you're going to see kind of a recurring theme here where I leave a little bit of white space around the lip of the flap of the mailbox and then I blend out the B97 on the body of the mailbox, and I'm still leaving that white space between the B97 line and the stamped line. Once I was done with the B93, I came in with the B52 again and filled in the white space. For the flag on the mailbox, I started out with R29 and added that up along the stem of the flag on the mailbox and then at the very bottom of the flag on the mailbox. Then I blended that out with R24, leaving a little bit of white space at the top of the flag, and then I blended that out with the R14. I know I'm kind of skipping over the envelope that the little snail is holding in his mouth, and that's because that was just very simple coloring. For the little doohickey thing around where the flag is attached, I didn't want to leave that white, so I came in with C3 and added that on the closest to the flag, and then I blended that out with C1. And that finishes up the coloring of my little snails. Moving on, I wanted to share a tip with you when stamping a solid stamp for the first time. If you ink it up with Versamark ink first, and then ink it up with your dye-based ink, the Versamark ink gives the dye-based ink something to stick to so you don't end up with all the texture and the beading of the dye-based ink on your solid stamp. I did stamp it twice just to make sure that I got a nice impression, but the Versamark ink definitely helped get a nice solid impression from that stamp. To finish up the card, I die cut a piece of the patterned paper from the Buttercup paper pack, and I used the card builder die. A little tip with the card builder die, when using the shapes that come with it, I would recommend that you cut the center shape first and then do the top and then the bottom. That way you can make sure that those shapes are cut out and they're pretty centered. Mine aren't exactly perfect, but they were close enough for me. I also cut a piece of white cardstock using the base from the card builder die and adhered the patterned paper on top of that. And then I adhered that to my card base, which is lemon drop cardstock from Cardstock Warehouse. It started out at 8.5 by 7. I scored it at 3.5 inches on the 7-inch side, so my finished card is 8.5 by 3.5. I played around with the placement of my little snails, who, by the way, I ran through my brother's scan and cut machine so it could cut it out for me. Once I had an idea of where I wanted them to be, I used a little bit of liquid glue to adhere the middle snail to the heart so that when I put a whole bunch of foam tape on the back of those images, that would be just one piece. After I removed all the release paper from all of my foam tape, I placed my images back on the card, and I didn't press them down right away. I just set them down so that I could shift them over if I needed to. And once I was happy with their placement, I pressed down so they would stay in place, and that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.